We're going to move to our second session for before lunch. We will defer the Q&As for Michael till later, if that's okay, as we move to wrap up. Approaching the stage now is James Pink. James is a medical director within Element. He started his career in the Sheffield NHS Trust, unbelievably 25 years ago. But he was at that point working on R&D, product safety, product liability and so forth. So moving forward from there into a consulting complex devices to getting products like to market. So the other thing that James is very passionate about is data analytics and the way in which we can use soft AI, as I call it, to be able to speed things up within the regulatory environment so that we're not spending so much time reading over and over stuff that we've seen before. So that's quite an exciting project that James has been working on with Element. Having said that, James, the floor is yours.
Cool. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right, so Michael's already spoken about establishing a regulatory strategy, so I get the really boring bit of explaining what that means. So everyone gets the market and the funding and all that stuff, and then we have to get into it. Well, essentially a regulatory strategy is defined as a science-driven assessment of a product's development options, which takes into key considerations and likely regulatory outcomes. It sounds really complex, but basically it says, look, if I want to get this product to the market, these are all the science-based stuff that I'm going to do. At the moment, I'm in a bit of a fight. I'm fighting poetry at this moment in time. Notified bodies and technical files and all sorts of submissions are going together effectively with lots of nice paragraphs and statements and words and words and words, as opposed to science. So one of the things that the regulatory strategy is going to do is going to say, what science, non-clinical and clinical evidence am I going to generate and gather through my journey of getting to a market? And then deciding which market you want to get to will then ultimately define exactly what science you will present at the end. But science is the most important bit around this, not poetry. Try and remember that. So whenever you're preparing dossiers, whenever you're writing something for a submission, ask yourself, am I being a poet or am I being a scientist, a technician, an engineer, a chemist, or whatever other thing we want to describe ourselves? It becomes incredibly, incredibly important when we are getting to that stage after the valley of death into being able to present solid evidence that we have a safe and effective device, because ultimately that's where we're trying to get. We want to get a device that is safe to a patient, and principally because somebody's gone and bought it and spent a load of money, they now need to know that it's actually going to have the outcomes that they wish to have, and that can be a healthcare practitioner or otherwise. So obviously the bench to bedside, I think I might have misinterpreted exactly what you meant, Michael, when we set out this thing, but I'm kind of assuming that's what you meant. But the regulatory strategy is the bit in the middle. It's what is the plan? Explain the plan to your market. Explain your plan towards getting the evidence to be able to support your claims and to demonstrate that the device is in effect safe and working. Now, Michael's described the valley of death at a sort of a pre-seed stage, but ultimately there's some research as well that says, you know what, you get this in your product development stages as well. This is when your great idea, you know, you've done all your research, you've done all your benchtop prototyping, it's a fantastic idea, you're now getting all your funding in, you now want to start commercialising, and strangely enough, these horrible pesky people like regulators start going, whoa, hold on a minute, you haven't demonstrated good science, or you've not demonstrated sufficient evidence. And that's a very sort of time-consuming and costly process to be going on far too late within the R&D or the TRL or whatever product development lifecycle you want to describe it as. So it's incredibly important that we look at exactly what that impedance is that we may see. Now, in certain studies, we've seen these startup maturity indices saying, why have you not started up? Why have you not excelled into commercialization? Why don't we have this product on the market? Why don't we have this product adopted on the market? Because getting a CE mark or an FDA approval is one thing, getting somebody to actually buy it often enough to return on investment is another thing. So ultimately, one of the major sort of stumbling blocks that you can see here in questions 20 to 25 is that regulatory and clinical readiness. Now, ultimately, if you've got a thing that's going to be a medical thing and it's going to do a thing, then ultimately you should be able to support that thing with science. And therefore the journey, although long, should be well known. You should at least go, well, I'm going to climb Everest. So, you know, I start here, I get to base camp, I have to make sure I'm all right with my oxygen, and can I tolerate it, am I fit enough, etc. So all those things should be known. Yeah, it should just be a journey. And of course there'll be headwinds and there'll be all sorts of other bits and pieces that get in your way. But the facts are is that the regulatory strategy that we produce in is the one that illuminates the research and development team, illuminates the commercial team, enables you to be able to say, right, this is the plan. From A to B, this is what we are going to do. So, we've seen that there's quite a lot of strikeout rates. We've seen that in US market, we want to get to the US market. It's much more predictable nowadays, that's what everybody's saying, but it's still bloody hard, very hard to get to that market, you know, and ultimately, if you're not aware of all of the things you have to do for sort of inspection readiness, what you need to submit for a 510K, a predicate device, if your device is novel, can I go through the de novo process or do I have to go through pre-market authorization? All of these things have to be answered and understood. And therefore, if you're sort of knocking on the door of the FDA saying, hey guys, we've got a submission, and you're not aware exactly what those evidence requirements will be, you're not aware of what those quality system requirements will be, you're not aware exactly what you need to present in terms of a legal infrastructure, such as an in-country representative, then you're going to have a problem. The other thing is that the startups fail. They fail because of insufficient evidence. You know, there's a lot of questions from notified bodies now. That's what they tend to do now. They become question-generating engines, notified bodies. And ultimately, many of those questions, guess what, are science-driven questions. They're driven from these standards that Eamon's been working with for years and years and years, and they're driven from those essential principles that have been introduced from us by Phil, and Michael's talked about them. And those essential principles don't go away. There are about 139 of them, and they're real. You can read them, you can see them. They're in 21 sections, or there are 23 sections in the European requirement, but you can see them, and you have to meet them and be prepared to present evidence that you, on an ongoing basis, have achieved them and continue to achieve them. So ultimately, we want to be able to see how that is impacting, you know, this sort of startup failure. And we only have to have a look at the MedTech Europe survey to say, well, do you know what? SMEs are struggling, put it that way. What's that? Up to 30% of SMEs have either no notified body or the notified body that they've got is yet to be designated. You know, that's a massive sort of miss on your regulatory strategy. What do I start doing if I want to go into Europe? Engage notified bodies. Begin to select notified bodies. Begin to sort of follow notified bodies if you want to get there. The next is, if you look at the timescales for certification, then you can see it's not just 18 months, more than 24 months in many, many cases. 73 out of, I don't know what the total cohort is there, but it looks like a good sort of 10-15% to me in my basic maths. But ultimately, we're seeing that it's taking a long time to get to market. Why? Well, ultimately, some of the reasons that we're seeing with notified bodies in Europe, for instance, is, let me give you a case in point, a product that is used for fluid path, so it's basically for helping get fluids into your body, that has been well established on the market for 15 years, has still taken 28 months for a notified body to do an assessment. They raised 700 questions over 3 rounds, you know, with reviewers that were simply asking around the essential requirements. So I managed to analyse all 700 of those questions, and I could find exactly each essential requirement that that reviewer was asking about. You know, so why are we in a situation where presenting evidence around essential requirements that are well established, well understood, but we're still getting that sort of, if you want, that impedance from the regulator or from the notified body that is stopping us from that sort of successful attempt. So how we can start with a regulatory strategy is with the end in mind, the market. Where do you want to go? What do you want to place on the market? And then from there, we have a number of clinical regulatory barriers to trade that we have to address. That is, do we actually know what medical device laws apply? Is it a medical device? A lot of that will be defined by the intended use. Do we know the classification? Will it be a high risk or a low risk device? Ultimately, that classification will then drive not your responsibility to meet essential requirements, but your responsibility to present evidence around those non-clinical and clinical requirements for them to be fulfilled. In terms of the product requirements, defining what the product is, what it does, what its primary mechanism of action is, what its operating principles are. Does it have batteries? You know, how much contact does it have with the human body? Does it contact other things? Has it got materials that are novel? You know, all of those type of things need to be well defined, well understood. And actually, when you begin in your R&D process, you can pretty much answer them in terms of what we want it to be versus what it is, and then whatever nexus there is in between them. If we think about the non-clinical and clinical evidence that is required, do you know what's required? If we have a piece of plastic that is then going to be helping as a conduit for fluids to go into your bloodstream, what are the most important things that you now need to present as science that you have solved? For me, it would be things like pyrogens. Pyrogens are bad when it comes to blood. You get really hot and sweaty, and if you're immunocompromised, you die. So ultimately, we need to ensure that we've got those pyrogens sorted. If we're enabling the fluid to go into the arm, we have to make sure that what that fluid is. If it's a cytotoxic drug and it leaks, it's going to hurt. Yeah, so it might hurt the nurse, it might hurt the patient, but hurt means they may end up with cancer themselves. So ultimately, we don't want to be in a situation where we've got this nice little bit of plastic that is now giving pyrogens, leaking, and not fulfilling its purpose. So actually defining that intended purpose, that primary mechanism of action, explaining what the risks are, understanding those risks, and then assigning the essential requirements that are being switched on by those product characteristics is absolutely essential when you are building your regulatory strategy. In terms of whether a device is a medical device in itself, the intended purpose, the design and construction, as well as the use environment and the principle of operation will all dictate whether it is actually a medical device. You've seen Michael's example. Yeah? All of those things need to be understood so that we can adequately define the products as a medical device. Thinking about the external ecosystem around you, many startups fail, quite frankly, because they haven't done the yellow box, which is the clinical engagement. Have I got a scientific advisory board? Have I got skin in the game in terms of patient representation? Have I got clinicians who are supporting my clinical state of the art? If not, you're bound to fail. It's already there in the statistics. Those guys not engaging those patients, not engaging the science, not engaging the clinical requirements will fail when it starts to come to actually making those submissions into the various jurisdictions. So in terms of starting, there's a simple roadmap, 11 steps if you wish. I couldn't get it down to 5, sorry. But there's 11 there. Ultimately, qualify your product as a device. What is its intended purpose? Think about the risk, think about the risk classification, and then begin to think about those scientific drivers from hazards, standards, essential principles, what clinical evidence you'll require, and then think about Michael's diagram of then all you do is put it in a technical file, have a quality system, presto, you're on the US market. Yeah? You can change your mind as well, and you will change your mind. Your device might have all of the bells and whistles that is going to change everyone's life forever, but ultimately you find out that it doesn't. But you then find out it has clinical utility. So you just have to change your claims, change your intended performance, change the intended populations, change the use environment, whatever, you can make those changes. The regulatory strategy needs to change with that actual decision that you're making. And as we said, probably less articulate as what Michael's just put with the 4 examples there of the pre-filled syringes, but the realities is that if you then begin to think about that intended purpose, it might move from being a general product, a borderline product, to the most advanced type of product, but ultimately you at least know where you are with the product. The other is the essential requirements. It is my mission that anyone who I speak to will come away thinking, what the hell are essential requirements? I'm going to have to find them out, particularly in medical device development. People involved in R&D and involved in product commercialization learn the essential requirements at the completely wrong time. They tend to learn them when a notified body has a question. They tend to learn them when the regulator asks a question. That's unacceptable. You should understand what are the key regulatory science principles that your product needs to demonstrate you have solved through your evidence generation. And that means very, very quickly sitting down, going through those essential requirements and saying, right, this is what we need to do in material safety, biocompatibility, sterility, software, electrical safety, EMC, blah, 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 blah. Yeah? And ultimately that will right size you for your development, and it will also change the odds of having an unsuccessful submission, and more importantly, it will change the odds of having a patient harmed by your products. Okay? So the regulatory strategy helps us think about that. The classification helps us think about the level of evidence that you're going to have to gather and submit to regulators, and exactly how many touch points you'll have with regulators. So basically a class 1, you might not see them. Class 3, they'll actually know your kids' birthdays. There's that much invasiveness in terms of the interaction that you will have with those devices. So here's an example then of some of the questions that you've got to ask. Right, what are the characteristics? What is my technology? The next, what are the essential requirements? Once you know that, you've now got a suite of non-clinical evidence and clinical evidence. And you can now think about the type of non-clinical evidence you are going to really put the science into. You don't have to put all the science in. It just depends on your product. If you haven't got an electrical product, guess what? You don't have to do electrical safety. Whoopee. That's 5 of the essential requirements gone. In terms of clinical evidence, as Michael was saying, what is the clinical state of the art? What's the gold standard at the moment? That gold standard will drive what evidence generation you have. If you are so far away from the gold standard, into sort of like, this is absolutely revolutionary, it's going to change everyone's lives, it's going to impact it, then you're not going to be sort of like doing basic substantial equivalence statements. You ain't going to be doing sort of a case series, here's some reports, we've had a couple of clinicians come back and feedback and say, yeah, it's great. Chances are the complexity of the clinical data can move right up to randomized controlled trials, double-blinded, meta-analysis, plus real-world evidence and registries. You might need to have all of that in place and those clinical questions addressed. And so there, go back to Mike's sort of role in the NIH, you can now sit down and go, right, what type of studies do I need to undertake to generate that clinical evidence? And then you build your technical documentation, which includes both all of the science to show those essential requirements are met, but also all of the science around your manufacturing processes and all of the material safety and all of the, the ongoing critical process activities. You need a good old quality management system, so your reg strategy needs to talk about how that's going to happen. You need to decide your classification, in this case it's classification in Europe, and then decide what your conformity assessment routes will be. They're routes, there's lots of the routes there, which then ultimately leads you to device registration, a declaration of conformity, and you can place it on the market. And back to John's point, that still might not get you any cash. Yeah? Health technology assessment should have been as right up there in terms of that clinical evidence that was done before. Okay, finally, Eamon's spoken about this, written about this. The strategy for regulatory compliance is, okay, you've got the product on the market now, well done everybody, big pats on backs. How are you going to keep it there when those essential requirements change, when the standards that actually meet those essential requirements change, when the clinical state of the art may change, when the technical state of the art may change, when regulations may change? How many regulations was it you said? It was some weird and wonderful 22,000 or something. Quite phenomenal. So ultimately, put all that together, we've got a reg strategy. Yeah, all in one. Obviously, if you need help, there are different people knocking about that can help you. TOPRA, RAPS, but there are quite a number of others, industry associations. I mentioned BIVDA. Thank you. Yeah, it's all right, don't worry. And there's MedTech Europe. There's a whole series of people who do help, will help, and ultimately can help. So there we go, Q&A. On time? Kevin.
Okay, so a couple of questions up there for you to take a look at, James. We've got a couple of minutes if you wanted to address those.
Has been said that most of the market is SME, but is this number of business or number of devices made?
Using them.
I can say that.
Go on then.
So there's an EU definition of an SME. There's an EU definition. I'll just shout. There's an EU definition of an SME that you can use. So it goes by number of employees, turnover, that sort of thing. So it's using that definition.
Shall I take the other one then?
Yeah.
It depends. Go and find out if there's clinical evidence available to support the claim that you're making for the populations that you're making, for the outcomes you're making. Classification does not dictate whether or not you need evidence, clinical evidence. What dictates whether you need clinical evidence is whether there's sufficient clinical evidence. So your regulatory strategy will be landscaping to see what clinical evidence is out there, what are those gold standards, what are the current standards of care, and then it will be also going into it and saying, right, okay, well, what evidence do we need to generate, of sufficient quality and sufficient amount? They're the two really, really important bits. Amount, yeah, you might have thousands of questionnaires from a doctor saying, yeah, this device is wonderful, but it might not be very good quality because it's a questionnaire from a doctor saying it's wonderful, rather than some sort of well-controlled, unbiased study.
Another really good question there, James. How do you think about senior management's involvement in all of this?
Well, for SMEs, senior management's the chief technical officer, the accountant, the R&D head, the manufacturing head, and the clinical head, which is obviously one person. Yeah, so they're all involved in it. But if you're thinking about a large organisation or a small medium enterprise now, we have to be totally involved in that regulatory strategy. In the development, it depends on what their skills and competencies are to be actually to be involved. It might be more around the market, it might be more around the intended purpose. Very often engaging in those statements of let's describe what our device is, what it does, what we intend it to do, and let's try and make sure we've kicked the marketing teams out of the room as quickly as possible and get real about, okay, now let's manage the nexus between now and what we'd like to do. Yeah, and ultimately I think the engagement with senior management is incredibly important. The involvement of senior management is a skills and competency game. That senior management might be the chief technical officer, chief scientific officer. It might be somebody who's really, really au fait with the market, with the clinical need, with the what do they call it, the IP, all that type of stuff, the prior art. So yes, they should be fully engaged in the development of that strategy, and they'll also be very financially driven, won't they? So ultimately, it's like which market. Everyone now wants to go to the FDA because it's predictable. Get ready. Don't be careful what you wish for. What else are you invoking as a result of that now? Are you now grouped up with a load of companies that are now having massive recalls? If so, FDA will look at you differently as an organisation. Are you've now subscribed to having unannounced inspections, perhaps, or even announced inspections, but only because someone else in the world has got a device like you've got that's causing problem? So now you've obligated yourself to US law. So as soon as there's a big problem and you get yourself a 483 or a warning letter, you ain't placing that market in the US for a little bit until you've resolved all of that type of problem. So again, the regulatory strategy just cannot be let's get to market. It's how we stay on market, and does that make financial sense?
Can I add to that from a large company perspective? It's really interesting if you look from a European perspective, the differences between the Medical Device Directive and the Medical Device Regulation. The regulation now has pulled in swathes of text from things like quality management systems, from clinical investigations to post-market surveillance, all sorts of stuff, right? So that's moved regulatory compliance from standards application to a legal responsibility. Now, I've always argued in any of the presentations that I've done that as the general manager of a company, right, your quality management system means that you do a management review, right? That's just one of those top line things. You do a management review. So how can the managing director sign off on a declaration of conformity if he doesn't know what those regulatory and legal requirements are for his company? So I've always argued that regulation now is, as well as a regulatory compliance issue, it's a business issue. And you should really think of regulatory compliance being part of your business